The year-end party at Blackthorn Group was everything Carter Hayes was not loud, expensive, and cruel. He stood near the edge of the room with a drink he hadn't touched, while Derek Moss raised his glass from across the crowd and called out loud enough for everyone to hear, "Carter, honest question, you planning to die alone, or is that still up for debate?" The laughter hit the room like a wave. No one looked away. No one said a word in his defense. And then, through the noise and the heat and the humiliation, a woman he had never seen before crossed the room, slipped her hand around his arm, and said with a calm, steady smile, "Sorry, honey. I've been looking for you everywhere." Carter Hayes had a system. He arrived at the office before anyone else made his own coffee and kept his head down until the work was done. He didn't eat lunch with the group. He didn't join the conversations that formed naturally near the printer or in the elevator. Not because he was arrogant, and not because he disliked people, but because somewhere along the way, he had quietly decided that the less space he took up, the easier everything would be. It was a habit built over years, the kind that becomes invisible to the person practicing it, but obvious to everyone watching from the outside. He was 38 years old, a mid-level analyst at Blackthorn Group, one of the largest financial firms on the East Coast. He had worked there for 11 years. He knew the systems better than most people who outranked him, could read a balance sheet the way other people read a menu, and had quietly corrected more errors in quarterly reports than he would ever take credit for. His name never appeared in any company newsletter. His performance reviews were described consistently as solid. That word solid was the professional equivalent of being told your personality was fine. His wife Diane had died 6 years ago, a brief illness that moved faster than anyone expected. They had been married for 4 years, and in those 4 years, Carter had understood for the first time what it felt like to have someone in the world who was genuinely glad you existed. When she was gone, the silence in his apartment wasn't just quiet, it had weight. He learned to live with that weight, the way people learn to walk with a limp. He stopped trying to fix it. He stopped letting people try to fix it for him. He went back to work, kept his head down, and made his coffee before anyone else arrived. That was how the people at Blackthorn had come to see him. The man who never talked about his personal life, never brought anyone to company, events, never laughed too loud, or complained too openly, or gave anyone a reason to look twice. Boring, some of them said. Closed off, said others. Sandra Prewitt, who sat 2 desks down from him and treated the office like a stage, had once described him to a group of interns as the guy who peaked at being reliable. The interns had laughed. Carter had heard it. He'd said nothing. The year-end party was not something Carter looked forward to. Every December, Blackthorn Group rented out a ballroom at one of the downtown hotels and called it a celebration. There were speeches from executives who never remembered his name, a catered dinner with food that was technically fine, and an open bar that most people used as permission to say things they'd been holding back all year. Carter went every time because not going would have required an excuse, and making excuses drew more attention than simply showing up and standing near a wall. He arrived at 7 in the evening in a dark suit that fit him well and had been dry cleaned recently. He got a drink from the bar, something amber neat, and moved toward the far edge of the room, where the noise was lower and the crowd thinner. He knew some people by name, nodded to a few of them, and found a position near a tall window that gave him a view of the room without putting him in the center of it. He was good at this. He'd had years of practice. Derek Moss was the kind of man who needed an audience the way other people needed oxygen. He was a regional manager, mid-40s, loud in a way that he had convinced himself read as confident. He had a group of people around him near the center of the room, junior managers, a few assistants, people who laughed at the right moments because Derek noticed when they didn't. He was already 2 drinks in when he spotted Carter standing near the window, and something about the sight of a man choosing to be alone at a party apparently struck him as an opportunity. "Carter." Derek's voice carried across the noise easily. It wasn't a greeting, it was a spotlight. Several heads turned. "You actually came this year. Didn't think you'd bother." Carter looked over. He offered a slight nod the way a person does when they're hoping a conversation will end before it begins. But Derek wasn't finished. He raised his glass in Carter's direction, the gesture theatrical enough that the people around him shifted to watch. "Honest question," Derek continued, loud enough to reach several nearby clusters of conversation. "You planning to die alone? Or is that still up for debate?" The laughter came quickly, not from everyone, but from enough people that it filled the space. Someone near the bar turned to see what was funny. Sandra Prewitt, standing not far from Derek, pressed her lips together in a way that could have been a smile or could have been discomfort. She did nothing either way. Carter stood where he was, his drink in his hand, the laughter moving around him like weather he had to wait out. He didn't look at the floor. He didn't smile to pretend it wasn't what it was. He just held his ground quietly the way he always did, and waited for the moment to pass. It didn't pass. Derek, emboldened by the response he'd gotten, kept going. "I'm serious," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone performing concern while doing the opposite. 11 years at this company, and you've never brought anyone to one of these. Not once. I'm starting to think no woman in this city has the patience for you, Hayes." More laughter. A few people at the edge of the group looked briefly uncomfortable, then looked away, which was its own kind of agreement. Carter set his drink down on the windowsill beside him. He was deciding in that particular way. A person decides when all the options in front of them are bad, whether to say something or simply walk away. He never got the chance to do either. A woman he had never seen before came through the far side of the room with the kind of unhurried certainty that made people move out of her way without being asked. She was in her early 40s, wearing a deep navy dress that was elegant without being theatrical, her dark hair pulled back cleanly. She didn't look around the room the way most people did when they entered a party, searching, calculating, trying to read the social landscape. She already knew what she was doing. She crossed the floor in a straight line, and the line ended at Carter. She slipped her hand around his arm, easy and familiar, as though she'd done it 1,000 times before. She turned to face the room, Derek, the group, the people who had been laughing, and she smiled. Not a wide smile, a calm one, the kind that didn't ask for anything. "Sorry, honey," she said, the words directed at Carter, but pitched perfectly for the room to hear. "I've been looking for you everywhere." The laughter stopped so completely that Carter could hear the music coming from the speakers at the far end of the ballroom. He could hear the clink of someone setting down a glass near the bar. Derek Moss's expression had shifted into something it took him a visible moment to recover from. He knew who she was. Most people in that room knew who she was, or recognized her face from the business section, or had heard her name attached to numbers large enough to feel abstract. Vivian Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Capital, one of the most influential private investment funds on the East Coast. She didn't attend industry parties often, which was part of what made her presence at something like this remarkable. She had been listed on the guest register as a special invitee of Blackthorn's executive board, a courtesy extended as a gesture toward a potential partnership that had been in quiet negotiation for months. Nobody in that room had expected her to walk across the floor and put her hand on Carter Hayes' arm. Carter himself certainly hadn't. He stood very still. His first instinct was to say something to clarify, to correct the obvious misunderstanding, to let this woman know that whatever she thought was happening, she had the wrong person. But her grip on his arm was steady, and when she glanced at him briefly, there was something in her expression that said very clearly, "Not yet." So he said nothing. He looked at the room. The room looked back at the two of them, recalculating everything it had just witnessed in the last 3 minutes. Derek cleared his throat and lifted his glass in a gesture that no longer carried any authority. "Well," he said, his voice several degrees quieter than it had been. "Didn't know you two were—" He didn't finish the sentence. There wasn't really a sentence to finish. Vivian looked at him without particular interest. "Have a good evening," she said. It was not an invitation for further conversation. Derek nodded and turned back to his group, which had already begun to fragment people drifting toward the bar or the dinner table or anywhere that felt less exposed. Within minutes, the cluster that had formed around Carter's humiliation had dissolved entirely. And for the first time in a long while, Carter stood in the middle of a room that had gone completely quiet on his behalf, not knowing whether to feel relieved or more unsettled than before. Vivian released his arm once the moment had passed. She stepped back slightly, giving him room, and spoke in a lower voice that didn't carry to the people nearby. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said. "I didn't plan that. I just couldn't watch it continue." Carter studied her face. She looked sincere. She also looked like someone who was already moving past it, the way a person does when they act on instinct, and immediately returned to the practical. "I'm Vivian Sinclair," she added, though her expression made it clear she understood he probably already knew that. "Carter Hayes," he said. "I work here." It was a strange thing to say, but it was honest, and she seemed to appreciate that. She left the party before 10 o'clock. Carter stayed another 40 minutes out of what felt like stubbornness, more than desire, and then he went home. He sat in his apartment and thought about almost nothing, which was what he did when something had happened, that he hadn't yet found a way to process. His apartment was quiet and familiar. His coffee maker sat on the counter. The silence had its usual weight. He went to bed and told himself that by Monday, the whole thing would have settled. It did not settle by Monday. By Monday morning, the story had already moved through every floor of Blackthorn Group with the efficiency that only office gossip could achieve. People who had never spoken to Carter directly found reasons to pass by his desk. Sandra Prewitt, who had stood by and said nothing, while Derek Moss performed his routine the previous Friday, now smiled at Carter with a warmth that had no precedent. He understood immediately what was happening. None of these people cared about him. They cared about a story. The story was that Vivian Sinclair had called him honey in front of a room full of witnesses, and no one could quite explain why. Carter had no explanation to offer because he had none. She was a stranger. He had told the two colleagues who asked directly, both of them asking, with the careful casualness of people who desperately wanted to know, that they were not in a relationship, that he didn't know her personally, that it had been a misunderstanding in the moment. Neither of them seemed to believe him, which said more about what they wanted the story to be than what it actually was. Then on Tuesday evening, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He answered it because he always answered unknown numbers, a habit from the years when Diane had been sick, and every call might matter. The voice on the other end was calm and direct. "This is Vivian Sinclair. I wanted to check that Friday evening didn't cause you any complications at work." Carter sat down. He told her it had caused significant complications, though not in the way she might assume. She asked if he'd be willing to have coffee sometime that week. "Not to explain," she said, "just to talk." He told her he'd think about it. He thought about it for most of Wednesday. The logic against it was straightforward. He had a quiet life, a manageable life, a life that asked very little of him, and in return made very few demands. Vivian Sinclair was not a quiet person. She was not a person you could remain adjacent to without consequence. Whatever her reasons for calling the world she occupied, the press attention, the industry scrutiny, the particular kind of visibility that came with her level of wealth, was exactly the kind of world Carter had learned to stay outside of. It was safer to keep his distance. That was the logical conclusion. He called her back on Thursday morning and said yes to the coffee. He couldn't have explained precisely why. Maybe because the alternative was going back to standing near walls at parties with an untouched drink, waiting for Derek Moss to find a new angle. Maybe because for one brief moment on Friday evening, in a room full of people who looked through him, someone had looked directly at him instead. He didn't know yet whether that was a good reason or a dangerous one. He just knew it was the reason. And Carter Hayes, who was a man of careful habits and reliable instincts, folded his hands on the desk in front of him and accepted that for the first time in a very long time, he had made a choice he couldn't fully explain. The coffee was at a small place near Midtown, not the kind of restaurant where people went to be seen. Carter noticed that immediately that she had chosen somewhere quiet, somewhere without valet parking or a hostess who recognized her face. He arrived first and sat with his back to the wall, which was another old habit. And when Vivian walked in, she was wearing a coat that carried the quiet authority of serious money without announcing itself, carrying herself in a way that made the room feel smaller rather than larger. She sat across from him and ordered black coffee without looking at the menu. He ordered the same. For the first several minutes, neither of them performed anything. That was the word that came to him later when he was trying to describe the meeting to himself performance. He had expected something careful and strategic, a managed conversation from a woman who had spent her career managing conversations. Instead, she folded her hands around her cup and said plainly, "I want to be honest with you. I didn't know who you were that night. I'd never seen you before." Carter nodded slowly. He told her he had assumed as much. She continued, "I saw a room full of people laughing at one person and decided I didn't want to watch it. That's all it was. I understand if that makes the situation more awkward, not less." He told her it made it more straightforward, actually. She looked at him as though she was deciding whether he meant that. He did. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Not about the party, not about Blackthorn Group, not about Sinclair Capital or deal structures or the business press. They talked about the city, about a restaurant that had closed the previous spring, that both of them had apparently gone to alone on separate occasions, about what it felt like to sit in a meeting for 3 hours and realize that every person in the room was saying something different from what they actually meant. Carter was not a man who opened easily, and he didn't open easily that morning either. But something about the way Vivian spoke directly without ornament, as though she had no patience for the version of conversation people used to avoid saying anything real, made the silence between his sentences feel less like withdrawal and more like thought. When they finally stood to leave, she said she would be in the building next to his office the following Tuesday for a meeting. She asked if he wanted to get lunch. He said yes before he'd fully decided to. Back at Blackthorn, the atmosphere had developed its own specific texture. The people who had once barely registered Carter's existence were now making deliberate contact, stopping at his desk with questions they didn't actually have, including him in emails where his input wasn't required, inviting him to lunch plans that had never been extended before. Sandra Pruitt had moved from polite distance to something approaching friendliness, which Carter found more exhausting than her previous indifference had been. He understood what was happening. He had become interesting to these people, not because of anything he had done, but because of a woman who had stood next to him for 4 minutes at a party. That was all it had taken to change 11 years of invisibility into visibility, and the mathematics of that depressed him more than the original invisibility had. The other current was harder to navigate. Somewhere in the weeks following the party, a version of events had begun circulating through the office that Carter was deliberately pursuing Vivian Sinclair. That he had known she would be at the party, that his positioning near the edge of the room had been calculated, that the whole scene had been engineered to manufacture exactly the impression it had created. The people spreading this version weren't saying it to his face, which would have at least been direct. They were saying it in the particular way that office gossip moved around corners through the filter of a third party, always attributed to someone else's observation. He heard the edge of it from a colleague named Marcus Webb, who told him with visible discomfort that a few people in Derek Moss's circle were describing Carter as someone who was working an angle. Carter thanked Marcus for telling him, and then sat very still for the rest of the afternoon doing his job. The Tuesday lunch happened, and then there was another one the following week, and over the course of the next 2 months, the meetings stopped being scheduled and started simply occurring. Vivian would send a message asking if he had time. He would say yes or no, and she accepted both without pressure. He noticed that she never asked personal questions directly. She moved around the edges of things and let him decide how close to come. He did the same with her, and they arrived, by some unspoken agreement, at a rhythm that felt less like a developing relationship and more like two people who had independently built walls and were now sitting on opposite sides of them, occasionally passing things through. It was during a dinner in late February, a restaurant she had chosen quiet, again corner table, that he finally asked the question he had been holding since the first coffee. He asked her why she had stayed in contact after the party. She could have walked away. The moment had been impulsive, she'd admitted that herself, and there was no practical reason to follow it. She looked at her glass for a moment, then back at him, because every person I've met in the last 10 years has wanted something from me, she said. Money, access, association, validation, every single one of them. And in that room, watching what those people were doing to you, I saw someone who wasn't getting anything from anyone. I was curious what that looked like up close. Carter turned that over in his mind. He said, "And?" She almost smiled. "You're exactly what you looked like," she said, which is very unusual. He began to understand over those months what she had meant by loneliness. Not the word itself, she never used it, but the shape of her life as it became visible in small increments. The way she arrived at every meeting, already prepared to defend her position. The way she held a slight physical distance from even the people who worked closest to her, as though she had calculated the exact radius at which she could function without vulnerability. She had built Sinclair Capital over the course of 2 decades, from a firm her father had left, half dismantled into something genuinely formidable. One of the most respected private funds on the East Coast, and the cost of that, Carter came to understand, was that she had spent 15 years in rooms where every person was measuring her, and she had learned to measure back before they could finish. She was not cold by nature. She had become precise as a form of protection, and the two things looked identical from the outside. He didn't tell her any of this. He didn't need to. She already knew it. What she needed, he suspected, was not someone to explain her to herself, but someone who could simply be in the room without calculating the distance. The press found them in March. Not in a dramatic way, a photograph taken outside a restaurant posted by someone's account with a speculative caption shared enough times that it made it into 2 financial gossip columns, and then one wider outlet that ran a brief item about Vivian Sinclair being seen with an unidentified Blackthorn Group employee. By the following morning, the employee had been identified. Carter's name was attached to the story. By the afternoon, the story had grown a layer of interpretation questions about the nature of the relationship, about why a woman of Vivian's standing would be spending time with someone at Carter's level, about what exactly he stood to gain. Vivian called him the evening the story ran. She said she was sorry. He told her she hadn't done anything wrong. She said she was going to handle it. He told her not to do anything on his behalf, which she ignored politely and completely. The consequences inside Blackthorn were more immediate. Richard Holton, one of the company's senior executives, called Carter into his office 3 days after the story ran. Holton was a man in his late 50s who had the particular quality of being extremely pleasant in tone while being entirely transactional in intent. He sat across from Carter and expressed warmly his concern about the attention the press coverage was bringing to the firm. Then, in the same warm tone, he suggested that if Carter did have a close relationship with Vivian Sinclair, it might be worth considering how that relationship could be leveraged to open some doors around the pending investment discussions. Carter looked at the man and said he didn't have that kind of relationship with anyone, which was both true and not a complete answer. And Holton smiled as though he hadn't quite believed it, but appreciated the discretion. Carter drove home that night, with a clear and specific discomfort settling into him. He had spent 11 years being invisible at Blackthorn Group, and the invisibility had been uncomfortable, but it had been clean. What was happening now was different. Now he was visible, but visible in a way that made him part of someone else's calculation. Holton wanted to use him. The press wanted to frame him. Derek Moss's circle wanted to discredit him, and somewhere underneath all of it was a simple and increasingly unavoidable truth. The distance between his life and Vivian Sinclair's was not something that could be closed by two people deciding to have lunch. It was structural, it was financial, and social, and professional. The world she operated in had rules that had nothing to do with who a person actually was, and Carter had no standing in that world, no armor against what that world could do. He thought about Diane. Not in the way he usually thought about her, quietly, with a grief that had gone smooth from being carried so long, but in a different way. He thought about what she would have said about all of this. She had been pragmatic and sharp, and she had never let him talk himself into paralysis when the real problem was fear, wearing the clothes of logic. He didn't know what she would have said. He knew that her absence was not something Vivian's presence could touch, and he knew that was not Vivian's fault. And he knew that none of this knowing was particularly useful. The video appeared in the second week of April. 40 seconds of footage clearly edited from multiple sources that showed Carter approaching Vivian at a public event, and later receiving what appeared to be a folder of documents from a Sinclair Capital associate. The edit removed all context from both clips. The resulting narrative, which spread faster than Carter would have believed possible, was that he had orchestrated the contact and was positioning himself to benefit financially from the relationship. The caption on the original post called him plainly a con man. By the time Carter saw it, it had already been shared enough times to register on 2 news aggregators. Blackthorn Group moved quickly and quietly. He was called into HR the following morning and told in language that was technically neutral but unmistakably clear that he was being placed on administrative leave, pending a review of the situation. The woman who delivered this information was professional and not unkind, and Carter listened to her, and then walked back to his desk, collected the few personal items he kept there, a mug, a notebook, a spare charger, and left the building at 10:45 in the morning on a Tuesday, carrying a paper bag and walking past the reception desk, where the security guard gave him a look that contained the particular blend of pity and relief that belongs to people watching something happen to someone else. Vivian called him that afternoon. He let it ring. She called again an hour later, and he picked up. She said she was already working with her team on a response, that she had documentation that would dismantle the video completely, that this was recoverable, and she intended to recover it. Her voice was controlled and focused, and he recognized the tone. She was in problem-solving mode, moving fast, which was what she did when she was frightened, but couldn't afford to show it. He told her to stop. She said she wasn't going to stop. He said, "Vivian, every piece of attention this gets pulls you further into it. You don't need this. You don't need any of it." There was a quiet on the line that had nothing to do with distance. Then she said, "I didn't ask you what I need." He told her he knew that. He told her he was grateful genuinely for everything she had done and for who she had turned out to be. And then he told her that he was going to step back, that it was the right thing for both of them, and that she shouldn't reach out for a while. She said his name once, Carter, in a way that didn't have any argument in it, just wait. He said goodbye and ended the call. He sat in his apartment for a long time after that. The paper bag with his office things was on the kitchen counter. The coffee maker was where it always was. The silence had its usual weight. He had done the reasonable thing. He had protected her from the association, removed himself from the situation, made the responsible choice. He told himself this clearly, and waited to feel the relief that was supposed to come with a decision made for the right reasons. It didn't come. What came instead was the particular variety of loneliness that arrives not when you are left, but when you leave, when you have chosen the silence and closed the door yourself, and the door stays closed, and the room is exactly as quiet as you made it. The weeks after Carter left Blackthorn's building were the quietest of his recent life, and not in a way that felt like rest. He woke at the same time each morning out of habit, made his coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with nothing particular to do, which was a condition he was not built for. He was a man who had always used work as ballast, not out of ambition, but because having somewhere to be and something to do had kept the interior of his life from becoming too loud. Without it, the apartment felt larger than it actually was, and the silence had a different quality than the one he was used to. This silence wasn't the grief weight of 6 years ago. It was something thinner and more immediate, the particular discomfort of a person who has made what he believes is the right decision and is waiting without much success for it to feel like one. He did not contact Vivian. He had said he wouldn't, and he was a man who kept to what he said. He followed the news cycle at a distance, watching the video story fade in the way those stories did when the next one came along, and he told himself this was confirmation that stepping back had been correct. The fire had gone out faster without fuel. He had been the fuel. Removing himself had been the logical move. He repeated this to himself at intervals throughout the day, and found it becoming less convincing each time, which was itself a kind of information. Marcus Webb called him in the second week to check in, which Carter appreciated more than he said. Marcus told him the office had moved on to other topics, that Derek Moss had been oddly subdued, and that Richard Halton had been in closed-door meetings with the board for several days running. Carter asked why. Marcus didn't know exactly, but said there was a feeling in the building that something was being managed from outside. Carter filed that away and said nothing. The Eastern Capital Summit was the largest investment conference on the East Coast, held annually at a convention center downtown over 2 days in late May. Carter knew about it, the way anyone in his field knew about it. It was the kind of event that shaped the professional calendar of everyone above a certain level, attended by fund managers, institutional investors, executives, and the financial press in numbers large enough to fill 3 floors of a building. He had never attended. He had no reason to attend. He was on administrative leave from a company whose executives were currently in closed-door meetings for reasons nobody would explain to him directly, and he was by every visible measure a man whose professional life had been paused at an inconvenient moment. He found out about what happened at the summit, the same way most people outside the room did, through a live stream clip that began circulating online on the afternoon of the first day. The clip was 2 minutes and 40 seconds long. It showed a press availability session in one of the conference's side halls, the kind of brief media moment that happened between panel sessions when journalists could catch speakers in transit. Vivian Sinclair was at the center of the frame, having just exited a panel on institutional investment strategy. She was in a charcoal suit, composed, and still in the way she always was in public. And a reporter had asked her, Carter could hear it in the audio, about the recent coverage regarding her personal life and whether it had affected Sinclair Capital's professional relationships. Vivian looked at the reporter for a moment. Then she said, "I'd like to address that directly, if I may." The camera stayed on her. She said Carter Hayes had never at any point solicited or received any material benefit from their acquaintance. She said the video that had circulated in April was a selective edit that omitted the full context of both recorded moments, and that she had documentation establishing this, which she would be filing through the appropriate legal channels. She said the man who had compiled and distributed the edit was a contractor with financial ties to a member of Blackthorn Group's executive leadership, and she said the name Richard Halton clearly and without hesitation in front of every camera in the room. Then she said the following, and Carter had to watch this portion of the clip twice, because the first time he didn't fully absorb it. "I chose to spend time with Carter Hayes because in 11 years at that company, he was apparently the only person in the room at that party who understood that how you treat someone with nothing to offer you is the only measure of character that actually counts. I noticed him before I approached him, because while an entire room was laughing, he was the only one who wasn't. I thought that was worth knowing. I was right." The clip had been shared several thousand times by the time Carter watched it. The comments were the kind that collected under anything involving a public figure and a private person, speculative, various, largely uninformed. He closed the tab and sat for a while doing nothing. She called him that evening. He picked up on the second ring. Her voice was the same as it always was, measured direct, but there was something underneath it that he had learned to recognize over the preceding months. A slight thinness, as though she had been running on a particular kind of focus for too long and was now on the other side of it. He asked her how she was. She said she was tired. He said that was reasonable. She said she wanted to see him, that there were things she had documented about Halton's involvement, that she needed to show him directly, and also that she was tired of not talking to him, which she said quickly and without decoration. He told her he'd come to her office the following morning. The documentation was thorough. Vivian's team had traced the video edit back to a freelance media operative who had been contracted through a shell arrangement connected to Halton's personal network. The motive was straightforward. Once you had the evidence, Halton had been engineering a version of events that would force Vivian into a position where she would rely on Blackthorn Group's goodwill to protect Carter, creating a dependency that he intended to leverage in the investment negotiations. It was transactional and cynical, and not particularly sophisticated once you could see the whole structure. Vivian had seen it early. She had spent weeks building the documentation before she used it, which was why she had moved when she did, and not before. Carter sat across from her in her office and read through what she placed in front of him. The office was not what he had imagined. It was functional rather than ostentatious, with 2 walls of windows and a desk that was covered in actual work. When he finished reading, he looked up. He said, "You could have done this without the public statement." Filed it, quietly, addressed it through channels. Vivian looked at him steadily. "I could have," she said. "That would have protected you legally. It wouldn't have protected your name." He understood the distinction. He also understood what making the statement publicly had cost her in terms of the attention it drew and the personal exposure it required from a woman who had spent 15 years controlling exactly how much of herself the public could see. He didn't say any of that. She knew it already. The outcome at Blackthorn moved quickly once the documentation became part of a formal legal process. Richard Halton resigned within 10 days. The board, facing the prospect of the firm being publicly associated with a coordinated attempt to manipulate a major investor relationship through personal targeting, moved to resolve everything as efficiently as possible. Carter's administrative leave was rescinded. He received a letter from HR that described the situation as a misunderstanding that had been fully clarified, language so carefully constructed as to be almost entirely content-free, but the meaning was clear. His position was restored. His back pay for the leave period would be processed within 30 days. He returned to Blackthorn on a Thursday morning. He arrived before most people made his own coffee and sat at his desk. The system still worked the same way. The spreadsheets were where he'd left them. Sandra Prewitt arrived at her usual time, looked at him and said, "Good morning," with something that was for once close to genuine awkwardness rather than performance. He said, "Good morning" back. Derek Moss passed his desk once during the morning without making eye contact, which Carter considered a satisfactory resolution. The people who had called him an opportunist, who had spread the version of events that made him a man working an angle, did not apologize. He hadn't expected them to. Apologies of that kind required a degree of self-awareness that coexisted poorly with the behavior that had made them necessary. What they offered instead was a return to the social arrangement that had existed before the party they left him alone. The difference was that Carter experienced being left alone differently now. He was no longer invisible to himself, and it turned out that was the only invisibility that had ever truly mattered. He and Vivian settled into something that was harder to categorize and easier to live with than anything Carter had previously tried to define. They had dinner twice a week, sometimes 3 times. She came to his apartment on a Saturday and seemed unbothered by its simplicity, the functional furniture, the single shelf of books, the coffee maker on the counter. She sat at his kitchen table and drank her coffee without commenting on any of it, which was precisely right. He went to one event with her, a small industry gathering that required his presence for about 90 minutes, and he stood beside her with the low-level discomfort of a man in a room where he doesn't quite belong, and made conversation with the people she introduced him to, and did not attempt to be something he wasn't. She noticed this. She didn't say anything about it directly. She did somewhere around the 40-minute mark, find his hand in a way that was quiet and deliberate and had nothing to do with a room watching. He never tried to match her world. She never asked him to. He remained exactly what he was, a mid-level analyst, with 11 years at a financial firm, a man who made his coffee before anyone else arrived, a man who had chosen silence for 6 years because the alternative had required more than he'd been willing to give. She remained exactly what she was, a woman who had built something formidable out of precision and discipline, who was cautiously, slowly, learning to let one person stand close enough to see behind it. The next year-end party at Blackthorn Group arrived in December, the way it always did. Carter wore the same dark suit, dry-cleaned. He arrived at 7. He did not head for the far wall by the window. He walked in the way a person walks when they are comfortable with the space they occupy, which is a different thing entirely from confidence. Confidence performs. This was simply ease. Vivian arrived 40 minutes after him, having come directly from a board meeting across town. She crossed the room and found him near the center of it, and when she reached him, she didn't take his arm in the careful, theatrical gesture of a woman making a point. She just stood beside him and said something quiet and specific about the meeting she'd come from, and he responded, and they stood there, talking the way people talk, when the conversation is for them and not for the room. The room noticed anyway. It always does. Derek Moss was there. Sandra Pruitt was there. The people who had laughed in December of the previous year, who had spread the version of Carter that made him an opportunist, who had moved out of his way and back into his way, depending on what the story was that week. They were all there, holding their drinks and watching two people talk to each other with the uncomplicated ease of people who had chosen each other for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone else present. No one raised a glass in Carter's direction. No one called across the crowd. No one asked him with theatrical warmth whether he planned to die alone. Carter Hayes stood in the center of a room that had once made him feel like furniture, next to a woman who had walked across that same room on an impulse and changed the direction of both their lives. And he understood something he had taken. The long way around to reach a man's worth was not his relationship status, not his salary, not the number of people who looked at him when he walked in. It was what he did when no one was watching. It was whether he kept his dignity when a room full of people were trying to take it. It was whether, when someone reached out with a simple and impulsive act of decency, he had enough left in him to reach back. Carter had enough left in him. It turned out that was more than sufficient.